Somewhere in Abbey Road, during the autumn of 1968, there was an 8-track tape machine sitting in a storage room. Not installed, not commissioned, waiting for the technical staff to finish evaluating it. And in the studio down the corridor, the most powerful band in the world was recording the most sprawling album of its career onto 4 tracks. Because 4 tracks was what EMI was prepared to give them. That is the fact I want to build this essay on, because it inverts almost everything that gets said about this record. The received account runs like this. The Beatles retreated to India, came back with a mountain of songs, went into the studio, and produced a work of unprecedented technical adventure. An album that pushed the equipment at Abbey Road to its limits and pioneered techniques that became standard practice in rock recording for the next 50 years. Most of that is true in outline. What it leaves out is the condition under which it happened, which is that the White Album was made on machinery that was already behind the state of the art, in a facility whose house rules the band had come to regard as an obstacle, by an engineering team that changed halfway through because the original engineer walked out. And once you know that, the album sounds different. Not worse, different and considerably stranger. Start with the 4-track problem, because everything else follows from it. A 4-track machine gives you 4 independent places to put sound. That is all. If you want more than 4 elements in the finished recording, and you always want more than 4, you have to combine. You record drums and bass and 2 guitars across the 4 tracks, then you mix those 4 down onto 1 or 2 tracks of a second machine, freeing up space, and then you carry on. That procedure is called a reduction or a bounce, and it has 2 consequences that shape everything you hear. The first is loss. Analog tape adds noise and loses high-frequency detail every time you copy it, so a part that has been bounced twice sits behind a veil that a part recorded last does not have. Listen to almost any track on this album with that in mind, and you can hear the strata. The lead vocal and the final overdub are in the room with you. The rhythm section is a generation or 2 back, slightly softer at the top, slightly noisier underneath. The second consequence is irreversibility. Once you have bounced 4 tracks into one, the balance between them is fixed forever. You cannot go back and raise the hi-hat. You have committed, which means that a 4-track record is not a record of infinite options. It is a record of decisions made under pressure and then lived with. And the engineer's judgment at the moment of the bounce is baked permanently into the finished object. Now take the thing that everybody notices about this album's stereo, which is the extreme separation. Drums entirely in one speaker, voice entirely in the other. Whole sections of the record that sound wrong on headphones, and that generations of listeners have interpreted as a deliberate psychedelic gesture, a 3-dimensional soundstage, an artistic choice. It is mostly not a choice. It is arithmetic. When your finished multi-track consists of a bounced rhythm bed on one track, a bounced overdub group on another, a vocal on a third and a solo on a fourth, then a stereo mix has 4 objects to place across 2 speakers, and there is very little you can do to disguise the fact. The hard panning of 1960s British stereo is the visible skeleton of the tape format. Add to this the fact that stereo was still, in Britain in 1968, the minority format, sold to a small and relatively affluent audience, and the priorities of the mixing sessions become clear. Which brings me to the single most important technical fact about this album, and the one that most listeners have never acted on. The mono mix of the White Album is a different record. The band attended the mono mixes. Those were the mixes that mattered, because mono was what the record-buying public and the radio would hear. The stereo versions were frequently prepared afterwards, faster, sometimes without the band in the room. And because these were separate operations rather than a stereo master with the channels folded together, they diverge, sometimes substantially. Helter Skelter is the demonstration. In stereo, the track appears to end, fades out, and then fades back in, and over the returning noise, Ringo Starr shouts that he has blisters on his fingers. That moment has become one of the most quoted seconds in the catalog. It is not in the mono mix. The mono version simply fades and stops. So the single most famous piece of documentary evidence about the ferocity of those sessions is absent from the version most British listeners bought in 1968. There is more. Don't Pass Me By runs faster in mono at a different pitch because of tape speed. Sexy Sadie has different vocal treatments. Several tracks have different fade points, different levels of effects, different lengths. The White Album is the last Beatles album to receive a dedicated mono mix, which means it is the last one where the version the band signed off on and the version most people now stream are genuinely different artifacts. If you have only ever heard the stereo, you have heard a translation. Now the Trident question, which is where the 8-track myth comes apart entirely. Trident Studios in St. Anne's Court in Soho had an 8-track machine before Abbey Road did. The Beatles used it. Dear Prudence was recorded there. So were Honey Pie, Savoy Truffle, and Martha My Dear. Hey Jude, from the same period, was cut there as well. The band went to an independent studio in Soho because the equipment was better than the equipment at the facility they had spent 6 years making into the most famous recording studio on Earth. That is not a small detail. It tells you what the relationship between the group and EMI had become by 1968. Abbey Road was an institution with technical staff in white coats, standardized procedures, and a testing regime that meant new machines were evaluated before they were released to clients. That regime had produced extraordinary things, including automatic double tracking, which the engineer Ken Townsend invented at Abbey Road, specifically because Lennon hated doubling his vocals by hand. But by 1968, the band had outgrown the institution's speed, and a portion of the White Album exists in Soho because of it. When 8-track finally did come into service at Abbey Road, late in the sessions, it changed the sound of the last things recorded. But the bulk of the album is 4-track work, and the album's texture, that peculiar combination of enormous presence on the top layer and a slightly crumbling foundation underneath, is a 4-track texture. And before I go further, one correction that has to be made, because it circulates in almost every long-form account of this album, including the earlier version of this essay. Blue Jay Way is not on the White Album. It is a Harrison song from Magical Mystery Tour, recorded in September of 1967, more than a year earlier, and its reversed tapes and phasing belong to a different project with a different sonic philosophy. Attributing it to these sessions is the kind of error that gets a video dismantled in the comments within the hour. And it matters here because the two records are being made under opposite assumptions about what a studio is for. Now the personnel, because the second half of this album does not sound like the first half, and there is a reason. Geoff Emerick had been the Beatles' principal engineer since Revolver. He had built the sound of Tomorrow Never Knows, of Pepper, of Strawberry Fields Forever, working in a facility whose rule book he routinely broke, placing microphones closer to instruments than EMI regulations permitted and running signals through equipment in ways the technical staff considered improper. He was 21 years old when he started on Revolver. On the 16th of July, 1968, he quit. Not the industry, not Abbey Road, but the Beatles. He has described the atmosphere in the room during those sessions. The personal abuse flying between the members of the band, the impossibility of doing careful work inside a permanent argument, and he walked. Ken Scott, who had been a tape operator and occasional engineer, took over, and Scott's approach was measurably different. Less inclined to the elaborate signal processing that Emmerich loved, more focused on capturing what was happening in the room cleanly and quickly. There is also Chris Thomas, then 22, whom George Martin left in charge of sessions when he went on holiday in September, and who ended up playing harpsichord on Piggies and mellotron on Bungalow Bill. So the technical authorship of this record is distributed in a way that no other Beatles albums is. Martin, Emmerich, Scott, Thomas, plus assistants, plus a band that increasingly worked in separate rooms on separate songs. And Martin's own role changed fundamentally. On the earlier records, he had been a co-author, writing string arrangements, scoring brass, translating musical ideas from men who could not read notation. Here he functions largely as an arbiter and a technical facilitator, capturing performances rather than constructing them. He did still arrange, and the arrangements he wrote are among the best things on the album, but his structural authority had gone. He argued that the material should be cut to a single strong album. He was overruled. There is also the drum question, which prog audiences in particular should care about, because the drum sound on this record is where a great deal of what followed comes from. Emmerich had spent the previous 2 years building the Beatles' drum sound by close miking Starr's kit, damping the heads heavily, often with cloths, and compressing hard, which produces the thick, dry, forward thump that defines Pepper. On the White Album, that approach is retained on some tracks and abandoned on others, and the abandonment is where the interesting things happen. Your Blues has almost no isolation at all. Helter Skelter is deliberately overdriven. Birthday has a compressed, snapping quality, with a cowbell pattern sitting high in the mix that points directly at 1970s rock production. And on 2 tracks, the drummer is not the drummer. Starr had walked out on the 22nd of August, during work on Back in the USSR, and McCartney sat behind the kit for that track and for Dear Prudence. The difference is audible, and it is instructive. McCartney plays busier, harder, and with less regard for the song's center of gravity than Starr ever did, filling where Starr would have left space. Comparing the two of them across those 2 tracks and the rest of the album is the single best available lesson in what a drummer actually contributes, which is not what he plays, but what he declines to play. Starr's reputation as a limited player has never survived contact with anyone who has tried to reproduce his time feel. Before the set pieces, 2 techniques need explaining properly, because they get named constantly and described badly. The first is automatic double tracking. Lennon liked the thickness of a doubled vocal and hated the labor of singing the same part twice in perfect synchronization. And he asked repeatedly whether the machine could do it for him. Ken Townsend, an Abbey Road technical engineer, worked out that if you take the signal from the record head of one machine and feed it to a second machine, then vary the speed of that second machine using a variable frequency oscillator, you get a copy of the vocal that drifts fractionally ahead of and behind the original, never in a fixed relationship. That drift is the whole effect. A perfectly synchronized copy would sound merely louder. An imperfectly synchronized copy sounds like 2 people, because 2 people never align exactly either. What matters for this album is how the technique had evolved by 1968. On Revolver and Pepper, it had frequently been used at extreme settings, pushed into audible warble and flange. Here it is applied constantly and subtly, thickening things without announcing itself. And the difference between an album where you can hear the process and an album where you cannot is the difference between a record that sounds like 1967 and a record that still sounds current. The second technique is varispeed, which is simply running the tape at a speed other than the one at which it was recorded. Slow the tape while recording, and the played back result is faster and higher. Speed it up while recording, and the result is slower and lower. This is not an effect in the modern sense, because pitch and duration cannot be separated, and that inseparability is precisely what makes it musical rather than cosmetic. When McCartney's voice on Wild Honey Pie arrives as a strangled falsetto, you are hearing a physical fact about a piece of tape, and the strangeness is not applied to the voice. It is the voice, relocated. Then there is microphone placement. And here, the album is a direct assault on the institution that housed it. Abbey Road maintained written guidelines on minimum distances between microphones and instruments, partly to protect the equipment from overload. Emmerich had been breaking those rules since Revolver, putting microphones close enough to a bass amplifier or a drum to capture the physical event, rather than the room's opinion of it. On the White Album, the close miking is everywhere, on acoustic guitars especially, which is why you hear string squeak and fingernail on Blackbird and on Julia at a level of detail that no rock record before this one had exposed. That detail is not decoration. It is the reason those two performances feel like a person rather than a recording. Now let me go through the individual technical set pieces, because this is where the record earns its reputation and where the details are better than the generalizations. Your Blues was recorded in a room off Studio 2 that was essentially a storage annex, a space so small that the four of them and the equipment barely fitted, chosen deliberately to force the sound of a cramped club onto tape. You can hear the walls. The bleed between microphones in a space that size is not a problem to be solved. It is the instrument and the raggedness of the ending, where the mix drops to an earlier take, is left in place. Long, long, long ends with one of the strangest sounds in the catalog, a rattling, moaning resonance that swells up and dies. It is a bottle of wine that had been left on top of a Leslie speaker cabinet. The Leslie contains a rotating horn. The organ note hit the resonant frequency of the cabinet, and the bottle began to vibrate against it. They heard it. They liked it. And rather than removing the bottle, they built the ending of the song around it, adding a vocal and a drum figure to what was, in origin, an accident of housekeeping. Savoy Truffle has a horn section that sounds broken, and it sounds broken because Harrison asked for it. Martin wrote the arrangement, 6 saxophones played it properly, and then Harrison asked the engineers to distort the recording heavily, which is reported to have upset the session players considerably, since they had just delivered a clean performance and were now hearing it destroyed. That distortion is a deliberate act of vandalism against professional musicianship, and it is the reason the track sounds like nothing else from the period. Helter Skelter went through an extraordinary process. An early attempt ran to something over 25 minutes, a slow, sprawling, hypnotic version that bears very little relationship to the released track. What eventually came out is compressed, screaming, and mixed to make the drums push the meters into distortion. McCartney's vocal is deliberately shredded. The influence of this on everything heavy that followed is genuine, and it was achieved not through equipment, but through refusing to protect the recording from the performance. And Revolution 9, whatever you think of it, is a piece of physical labor. Tape loops of that era had to be threaded around the room and held under tension, often with pencils and microphone stands, running from machine to machine so that a loop could be long enough to be interesting. Multiple loops running simultaneously on multiple machines. Faders operated live by whoever was available, mixed in real time because there was no way to store the result, other than by capturing the performance of the mix. It is 8 minutes and 22 seconds of collage assembled by hand. Its ancestry is worth stating precisely, because the usual comparison is lazy. This is not Stockhausen. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, whose face is on the sleeve of Pepper, was working in the Cologne studio on electronic music. meaning sound generated from oscillators, organized by serial procedures with a level of compositional rigor that has almost nothing in common with what is happening here. The relevant lineage is the Paris one, Pierre Schaeffer and Musique Concrète, which begins from recorded material, from found sound, and proceeds by cutting and looping and reversing. Revolution 9 is a concrete piece made by people who had access to an EMI tape library and a very large amount of studio time. The other thing to say plainly is that Yoko Ono's contribution here is substantial and is routinely either erased or blamed. She was a working artist from the Fluxus milieu. She had been making performance and conceptual work in New York and London for years before meeting Lennon. And the aesthetic of duration, repetition, and instruction that shapes this track is native to her practice and foreign to his. Attributing the piece to Lennon alone is a misattribution. Attributing the album's collapse to her presence in the studio, which was the standard line for decades, is something worse than a misattribution. So what does all of this mean for the audience of a progressive rock channel, which is who I am talking to? Progressive rock built its identity on the studio. The genre's founding assumption is that a rock record can be a constructed object of the same order as a composed work. That the studio is an instrument. That time and money and multi-track capacity are the raw materials of ambition. The mythology traces back to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, to the idea that if you spend long enough in a room with enough equipment, you can build anything. The White Album says something almost opposite, and it says it from inside the same band. Everything I have described here is a product of constraint. 4 tracks forcing irreversible decisions, bounces creating audible generational strata, a stereo image dictated by tape arithmetic, a mono mix that is the real one, an engineer leaving and a different pair of hands taking over. Distortion as a deliberate wound inflicted on a clean arrangement, an accident with a wine bottle promoted to a compositional event. None of that is unlimited capacity. All of it is decision under pressure, and the album's roughness, the thing that made critics in 1968 call it unfocused, is the sound of decisions that could not be undone. Progressive rock inherited the ambition and discarded the constraint. 16 tracks became 24, 24 became 48. Sessions stretched from weeks into years, and the genre produced some of the most gloriously overbuilt objects in the history of recorded sound, and also some of its most inert. The point at which a record stops being a set of committed decisions and becomes an infinitely revisable file is the point at which it starts to lose the thing that makes the White Album still sound dangerous. I am not making an argument for primitivism. The technical achievement here is real, and the people who made it were operating at the extreme edge of what the machinery allowed. But the machinery was old, the facility was slow, the team changed mid-project, and the band were barely speaking to one another. And the record they produced under those conditions is still, more than half a century later, the one that sounds least like it was designed. There is a practical version of this argument, and I want to state it, because it applies to anyone listening who makes records. Every technique I have described exists because somebody had to solve a problem in the room that day with what was available. Automatic double tracking exists because a singer refused to sing a part twice. The ending of Long, Long, Long exists because nobody moved a bottle. The horn sound on Savoy Truffle exists because a guitarist decided a professional arrangement was too clean and destroyed it after the fact. The claustrophobia of Yer Blues exists because 4 people walked into a storage room. None of these came from a specification. All of them came from constraint, plus a willingness to accept an accident as a decision. Progressive rock, at its best, understood this. The mellotron is an unreliable machine. and the genre's most beloved instrument. And it is beloved precisely because its tapes wobble and its notes decay after 8 seconds, whether you want them to or not. At its worst, the genre spent its money on the removal of exactly that kind of resistance. And the records where you can hear that money being spent are the ones that have aged worst. The 8-track machine sat in the storeroom for months while all of this was happening. That is the album.